welcome to Interlinks. Interlinks is a program about international business and globalization and the effects these have had on our life, our work, and our travel over the last 50 years or so. In each program, we interview a person from another country or with strong connections to another country. We get their unique perspective on these matters and how they have affected their life, their work, and their business. There's a little bit of history, a dash of economics, a sprinkling of business, and an overlay of personal experience, both from me and from my interviewees from around the world. Today, we will be talking to Dr. John Carr. John is a recognized international expert in supply chain management. His career stretches back to the 1980s with management positions at companies such as Digital Equipment, EMC, Samsung, Irish Express Cargo, and Flex International. John has a doctorate in supply chain and master's degrees in advanced manufacturing and business administration, and currently heads the supply chain consultancy Offer with clients in both the multinational and SME sectors. I'm delighted to have John join me on the line today. Welcome, John, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. It's a pleasure to join you.
So tell us a little bit about how your career started. I understand it stretches back to the 1980s. So how did your career start and how did it progress over the years to the point we are here now?
Certainly. I joined Digital Equipment in Galway in the mid-80s as a process engineer. I was involved in the introduction of new products to the Galway site. Really exciting time, I have to say. Great company. The company were really innovative, in terms of bringing mini computer, networking, speech recognition, so many technologies that we take for granted now to market. So a great company to start my career with in manufacturing. My job also was great in the sense that I was able to meet with suppliers across Europe. So my job was ensuring that they delivered the highest quality levels of components to our site and products to our site. The EU at the time had this policy called country content. So a lot of countries in Europe were looking for companies either to establish operations in country or source from suppliers in country. So Digital was very involved in partnering with companies right across Europe, and I was fortunate to be part of that. Subsequent to Digital, I moved on to work for companies such as EMC, Samsung, Irish Express Cargo, and Flextronics in a broad range of roles, from engineering to quality, procurement, manufacturing, and global supply chain. And I spent best part of 20 years working for Flextronics, up until a year ago when I set up my own consulting company, again, focused on supply chain, working with both multinationals and startups. And I also do some lecturing in the University of Limerick. So it's been a very interesting career. And I've ended up in supply chain through, a very interesting journey through working with these companies.
Yeah, very, very active. And you can see that relationship really between engineering, manufacturing and supply chain. So how have you found in that period since the 1980s that manufacturing has changed in terms of where it's done, how it's done, and by whom it's done?
Yes, back in the 80s, 90s, a lot of companies in the West were sourcing components from countries such as China, in particular electronics components from China. Now, other countries obviously play a key role. Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, they've all become key sources of components, I would say, to the electronics sector. And with that, companies have also established operations in Asia, brought in management from the West. But local management are very strong in Asia, and these companies are very mature now, and signs on it. You can see the growth in China over the last 30 years. It's been very impressive. I see about 6% average growth rate per annum over the last 30 years in China. So these companies and the countries that are involved in supplying products are benefiting, I would say. Now, one of the risks, of course, associated with manufacturing offshore is the management of offshore operations. And a lot of companies follow the Japanese in terms of how they delegated management of supply chain to tier one suppliers. So the tier one suppliers started to become very, very strong. Now there's also a risk associated with that because companies need to, manage innovation as well as cost. And clearly there's an huge importance in managing risk. So I would just summarize by saying companies who are outsourcing their manufacturing to offshore entities need to control the actual costs, of course, and retain control over the cost of goods sold. But they also need to take into consideration, clearly, the environmental and social impacts of offshore manufacturing and sourcing, and also need to maintain very strong relationships with suppliers, in particular suppliers who provide them with the early warning signals around risks that happening in the world of supply chain. So again, it's an onerous task. Supply chains have become more complex, and they require a lot of skill management.
And what you've described there, I guess, and that change that's taken place in that period is like the manifestation of this increased globalization that has been ongoing and has been in the news, and you hear about the positive effects of it and the negative effects of it. And the type of company that you worked for with Flex, I guess, was an embodiment of that kind of outsourced manufacturing and outsourced logistics and supply chain services. What factors do you think drove that? How did those companies come about, and how did they insert themselves into this kind of globalized economy as key players?
Yeah, so the primary driver, of course, of outsourcing is cost. Companies are continuously looking at how they can actually reduce their costs, be it labor, facilities, plant and equipment, and make those costs more variable. So it's the key driver. But there's another benefit, and that is the flexibility that comes with outsourcing manufacturing to mature, outsourced providers. Allows companies to introduce products more speedily to market, and also the contract outsourced companies today are involved in every aspect of supply chain, including product design, including distribution, after sales support. So it's a continuum of services now that are provided. So it's not just simply manufacturing, and it hasn't been for about 20 years. And now mature companies, you mentioned Flex there. So mature companies such as Flex offer the full suite of services from design through to managing the circular, supply chain. Mm-hmm. I would say that one of the big challenges, of course, is managing inventory. And we're all familiar with the just-in-time systems, and they work very well. They provide a flow of product in most situations. However, if you just take the current situation, where there's increasing demand and a sharp increase in demand, I would say, for things like personal protective equipment and ventilators, those sharp spikes in demand don't sit very well with just-in-time systems. So managing inventory has become critical. And I think a lot of companies, they recognize that they can achieve labor cost savings by moving offshore. And those savings depend, of course, on the labor content within the product. But equally, companies have come to realize that there's additional inventory holding costs, and that can be very significant. I've done many analyses over my time over the years, and I've seen many cases where local and regional manufacturing can result in 60 to 70% lower inventory carrying costs for companies. So you've got to outweigh and you've got to weigh the cost savings with the additional costs involved, such as managing inventory. So I think that's very important. And I think a lot of people recognize that. The other point I'd like to make, by the way, is that I think that the recent and the current COVID pandemic has brought home to people the need for risk management. When China shut down in their early part of the year, a lot of companies and a lot of industries, for instance, the automotive sector, you can see how heavily impacted they have been with the shutdown in China, and that kind of drives home the fact that we're all interconnected, way more now than in the past, and we need to be very careful and very cautious of the risks associated.
And do you think now with the COVID-19 pandemic that there will be significant changes in the supply chain? You know, this model of very long supply lines, intercontinental supply lines, optimization of inventory, and sometimes the actual network being global. Do you think we're heading to a different design of some of our supply chains for the future because of COVID?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. I mean, with over like 50% of the world GDP now in lockdown, we're all seeing the collapse in commercial activity. And it's more severe, I would say, than previous recessions. This cross-border investment it's predicted that it will drop by 30-40% as a result. So no question, things will change. Companies will be looking at local sourcing, regional sourcing. I also and second sourcing in many cases. I also think we have to look very clearly at the products that we're outsourcing and look at their criticality. So, for instance, we're heavily dependent on India for pharmaceutical ingredients, as an example. So, I think that, and with the continued shutdown there until early May, we have to look at all the components, all the commodities that we source. We have to look at their criticality, and we have to take the appropriate actions. So in some cases, I think we'll continue to source. No question, we'll continue to source in Asia for obvious reasons, because Asia is a huge economy, and we want to be trading with Asia and continue that post COVID. But then there's more critical, I would say, products like vaccines and medicine and medical devices that we need to look very carefully at. The other point I'd like to make is that when you look back at 2002, at the time of SARS, China only accounted for 4% of global output back then. But since then, China's output now is 4 times greater. So China now accounts for 16% of global output. So that's why, even though we noticed the impact at the time, back in 2002 with the SARS pandemic, it's becoming way more pronounced now with the current pandemic.
Even before COVID, we had pushback against economic globalization with things that had, particularly since 2016, so we had Brexit, we had the election of Donald Trump with a more kind of protectionist outlook on trade. We had rising nationalism, we had trade wars and so on. So do you think that globalization is in reverse, or is it just changing form? Where do you think we're headed with it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that it's in reverse. I think it's irreversible, to be honest with you. And we are very interconnected, for sure. I mean, if you just look at the banking crisis in 2008, you can see how, interconnected our whole banking system has become. With the internet, obviously, we're all susceptible to the same cyber attacks, regardless of where in the world you are. So we're very interconnected. That's not going to change. Those systems are in place, and that's not going to change. But equally, we had to take into account the Asia is a huge economic bloc. 44% of all global trade is intra-Asia, which is very significant. So we will continue to trade very strongly post this pandemic. So I don't see a reversal of globalization. Companies are aware of their environmental considerations, so they're taking appropriate action, I would say. And countries as well are similarly taking action. Prior to the COVID pandemic, a lot of discussion was around climate change, and that will continue. We all know we have responsibilities in that area. So I don't see a reversal. No, I don't. I just think we need strong leadership, and we need to we need to work very, very closely and collaborate very closely.
You remember when you and I were back in school many, many years ago in the 1970s or back then, and you'd look at your geography book, and there was a graph in it of the world population that kind of just was an exponential graph. And, the population was projected to go off into 12 billion or something ridiculous like that. And a lot of people still have that in mind, but in actual fact, our challenge at the moment now is probably going to be population stagnation, particularly in Europe and Japan and even in China. And you and I know from our day-to-day shortages that we experience in Ireland in terms of warehouse operatives or drivers, HGV drivers, forklift truck drivers, factory workers, and so on. What do you think all of this means for the world, the future of recruitment, work, skills, talent, and automation, and so on?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think it needs to be front and center as we move forward. So, there's no question in terms of population and demographics, there's huge change. For the first time in history, the world's population is expected to stop growing now by the end of this century, and that has huge repercussions. Also, the current median age in the world is 31, and by 2100, which is like only 80 years from now, the median age will be 42. So you're going to see a very steady increase in the median age of workforce. And also from a global perspective, you mentioned global perspective, a lot of the population growth will come from areas like Africa, for instance. The population in Africa is projected to increase from 1.3 billion currently to 4.3 billion. And indeed, 50% of the growth in population over the next 80 years will come from 6 countries. 5 of those countries happen to be in Africa. So it's a huge demographic shift. So the implications of this are very stark. I would say the first is a great need for lifelong learning. People will be working, longer, and there's a willingness and people want to work longer. The workforce is highly educated. More people can work from home. So I think lifelong learning is going to be more critical. I also think the adoption of automation is also key, and particularly in small and medium-sized enterprises. They are the backbone of the economy, and whilst we talk about automation and we're all involved in it, I think it's so important that we bring the small and medium companies along, and they will, I think, greatly benefit from adopting automation. We should continue to focus on language skills. It's a globalized world now, and we're good in Ireland at adapting to different cultures and providing support. So I think continue to focus on language skills is so important. And I also think as well, we have an ambition, I think, to be recognised and continue to be recognised in the globe. And I think we can take on various initiatives, like, for instance, post-COVID. I think there's new industries will come out of this current situation. So I think we'll play a big role in that.
And in this current situation we're in now, what kind of projects are you involved in currently, and what are your plans and ambitions for the future in your own work and business?
Yeah, so for the past 4 weeks now, I've been involved in a task force focused on sourcing critical PPE and equipment and other supplies. And we've been bringing up local source of supply in Ireland, working closely now with the IGA and Enterprise Ireland and other support agencies. So it's really, really interesting 4 weeks for me. It brings me back to my early part of my career, in the 80s and 90s, when, there was a lot of focus on local sourcing. And what I'm finding is, the amount of talent in Ireland is astounding. I mean, there's incredible innovation, and that comes to the fore during times of crisis. So I'm very, very hopeful of the future when I look at the talented companies we have here. So I hope to continue to connect the dots, as it were, and make introductions for companies to work closely together.
What do you think Ireland's role should be in the future? So we've spoken about how the world is changing radically and quite rapidly now, and we have been very successful with FDI and so on over the years. What do you think is next for us as a country?
I think, obviously we play a key role in Europe, and Europe, has to be strong. I think coming out of the current situation that we're in, we have to look to countries to collaborate very, very closely. Reminds me of a book that I read some time ago, which talked about the sort of situation we're in now, and how can we work our way out of this. So if you look at, for instance, the First World War, after the First World War, there was a lot of protectionism put in place. There was a rise in nationalism, and there was an economic depression as a result of that. But then if you look at post-Second World War, there was a lot of cooperation. We had the Marshall Plan, we had the UN and the General Agreement on Tax, on Tariffs and Trade. And, there was a lot of growth and prosperity came out of that period. So I think now Ireland has a role to play, clearly in Europe, but I also think on the international stage as well. We have a role to play in helping to build bridges and build that collaboration globally.
Yeah, I think we're probably a pragmatic, non-ideological nation that can make connections between rival groups maybe and rival visions of how things should be done.
I agree. And we tend to think long-term in Ireland. We do. It's easy to, be focused on you have to focus on the here and now. We have to focus on, what needs to be done now. But we also think long-term, and that's one of our strengths. I think in Ireland, we have a good reputation for long-term.
Yeah. And then maybe just change tack a little as we get into the final couple of minutes of the interview. What kind of things do you like to do in your spare time, hobbies and pastimes and so on?
I suppose when you look at the lovely weather we're having now, kind of draws you outdoors. I like the outdoors. I like to go for a cycle, walk, a little bit of golf when I get the time. But I'm an outdoors person, and I enjoy the open air. Yeah. Actually, it's quite pleasant right now because there's so few cars on the road, and
when you do go out, it's actually lovely out.
Yeah, you can hear the birds, and it's great.
Yeah. Have you read anything lately that was kind of inspiring that you'd like to share with listeners?
Yeah, no, I have. I tend to keep up with reading, but it's funny. I often dip back into books that I read in the past, and some I treasure. And I've just finished reading it for the second time now. A book by Richard Branson. It's called The Branson Way, and it's not a new book by any means, but it's a great book, and I highly recommend it. I mean, what I like about Richard, by the way, is he's visionary. Also, he's big into brand and building brand equity within his enterprises. And, I think brand is such an important aspect of companies now and countries as well. We have to respect brands, and but brands themselves, they have to respect ethos and of the company. And we just talked now for a few minutes about globalization. We've talked about environmental change, and I think strong companies and strong brands reflect everything that's good.
And people who are interested in finding out more about your activities and your current business, in terms of website or phone numbers, how can they contact you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. So happy to, talk to people on LinkedIn. I do have a website, but it's only in its early stages now. So over the coming months, I'm planning to put more material up there on the website, and also plan on running a blog as well, talking about supply chain and supply chain management.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Keep well, keep safe, and look after yourself and look after your family.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben.
Very welcome. Thanks also to our listeners. And remember that if you would like to find out more about globalization, international business, and how we can help you to formulate and implement new business strategies for the new supply chains of the future, please check out my blog and website on albalogistics.com and my book, International Supply Chain Relationships, which can be purchased on Amazon and Google Books. This is Patrick Daly of Alba Consulting. Goodbye and keep well until next time.